Welcome to Mayer Brown's Global Financial Markets Podcast. Each 30-minute episode is designed to help listeners better understand the legal issues that impact their business given the ongoing uncertainties in the financial markets worldwide. Speakers from across Mayer Brown's practices and offices provide their timely insights on a wide range of topics, including finance, financial services, and insurance regulatory developments, securitizations, and litigation in the United States, the United Kingdom, Europe, and Asia. We hope you enjoy the program.
Hello, listeners. Our topic today is algorithmic bias and unfair discrimination. Algorithms and artificial intelligence, or AI, are increasingly being deployed in the financial services industry with incredible potential to automate and enhance processes, increase efficiency, improve customer service, and augment investment and lending analyses. However, with these potential benefits come challenges, and there is increased risk that AI applications may result in unintended bias or unfair discrimination against certain subgroups. On today's episode, we'll discuss these potential risks. We'll start by defining AI for today's discussion and explore ways that AI applications in the financial services industry might result in unintended bias. We'll then take a look at what the regulation landscape looks like with respect to AI. And finally, we have some tips for you on how to manage this risk within your organizations. My name is Niketa Patel, and I'm your host. I'm a partner in Mayer Brown's litigation and dispute resolution practice in New York. I focus primarily on complex commercial litigation, contractual disputes, product liability matters, and AI-related issues. Our guests today are Jenn Rosa and Tori Shinohara. Tori is a partner in the firm's Washington, D.C. office and a member of the Consumer Financial Services Group. She focuses her practice on issues of fair and responsible lending, including issues of algorithmic bias. Jenn is the co-lead of the firm's New York litigation and dispute resolution practice. Jenn concentrates on the areas of banking and financial services, handling litigation and investigations involving alleged violations of the securities and antitrust laws, breach of contract, and allegations of fraud or misrepresentation in the sale of complex financial instruments. Jenn and Tori, thanks for joining us today. We'll start by turning it over to Tori so we can do some level setting. Tori, how are we defining algorithmic bias for purposes of today's discussion? And can you walk us through some examples of how AI applications might result in unintended bias in the financial services industry?
Thanks, Niketa, for having us today. So as Niketa said, we wanted to do a little bit of level setting around what we mean by the term artificial intelligence and what we mean by the term algorithmic bias as we're going to be using them during this podcast. The term algorithm, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and model are all terms that are used interchangeably often, and different people define them in varying ways. So for the purpose of our presentation today, we'll be largely focused on a subset of artificial intelligence known as machine learning, which we refer to as the capability of a machine to imitate intelligent human behavior. The machine learning system is typically used to perform complex tasks in a way that's similar to how humans solve problems. It may leverage historical data to identify patterns and make recommendations on risk assessments, for example. It may also define how to proceed with a given task or decision or deliver personalized advertisements. It's important to note that we haven't yet seen a consistent definition of artificial intelligence or algorithms or machine learning from federal regulators, but there have been a few various definitions that have been proposed, and we'll talk a little about those today. The term algorithmic bias, as we use it today, is used in a lot of different contexts, and frankly, this term has sometimes been used in ways that are incorrect. When thinking about algorithmic bias, it's important to distinguish between a model or an algorithm that is biased because one or more of the variables in the model is biased, or a model that's biased because the data it was trained on were biased. In contrast, there may be situations in which a model is not biased, but still results in a disproportionate adverse effect, also called a disparate impact, on one or more protected groups. For example, you may have a well-developed, unbiased credit model that uses only neutral, objective indicators of creditworthiness, but it still may have a disparate impact on minority applicants because of societal inequities related to income and wealth. But this is different than a model that creates a disparity or exacerbates disparate outcomes because of bias in the model itself. So for example, the recently released blueprint for the AI Bill of Rights includes a definition of algorithmic bias. This is not a perfect definition, but the AI Bill of Rights describes algorithmic discrimination as something that occurs when automated systems contribute to unjustified different treatment or impacts disfavoring people based on their race, color, ethnicity, sex, which includes pregnancy, childbirth, and related medical conditions, gender, identity, intersex status, and sexual orientation, religion, age, national origin, disability, veteran status, genetic information, or any other classification protected by law. Depending on the specific circumstances, such algorithmic discrimination may violate legal protections. And so with that kind of level setting out of the way, we wanted to provide you with a few examples of how there are risks of AI discrimination and risks of potential bias that are being used in AI today in financial services. Algorithms in AI are increasingly being deployed to assess risk in different contexts. One application of AI tools that's frequently cited is for fraud detection and identification. This is potentially a game changer because the AI can leverage both financial and non-financial information about a customer to make a risk determination. One particular use case that we've seen frequently is in the insurance industry. And this came up recently and was in the news when an insurer recently announced that it would use AI to analyze customer claim videos for signs of fraud. And it also highlighted and kind of touted the AI tool's use of nonverbal cues in its analysis. Unfortunately, the claim received some backlash and accusations of bias, and customers were concerned that their claims would be denied because of the color of their skin, or if they looked like they were lying because of some sort of nonverbal cue. And there was criticism of this insurer and the reliance on facial recognition technology, which has come under scrutiny for recent years for bias, including the inability to correctly identify Black and brown faces. This was an issue that became a little bit of a PR nightmare, and the insurer had to kind of walk back the announcement and make clear that the AI wouldn't be used to reject customers based on skin tone, physical appearance, a disability, or some other type of personal characteristic. There was actually recently a class action lawsuit filed against another insurer for using this type of technology in claims. And in that case, the lawsuit alleged that Black and brown customers were disproportionately disadvantaged by the use of this type of technology in claims because their claims were delayed. And the lawsuit alleges that this violated the Fair Housing Act. This lawsuit is still pending, but just a good example of something that's been in the news lately of how the use of AI and algorithms can potentially raise concerns around bias. Another key example with respect to AI and unintended bias arises when algorithms control ad delivery. A well-known study that was done by a team led by Northeastern University performed this study on a social media platform, which used an AI-powered tool to deliver ads. And the study ran a series of otherwise identical ads with slight variations in available budget, headline, text, or image. And the study found that those subtle tweaks had significant impacts on the audience reached by each ad. For example, postings for preschool teachers and secretaries were shown to a higher percentage of women, while postings for janitors and taxi drivers were shown to a higher percentage of minorities. While having the same targeted ad options selected for job applications, the algorithm's actual target audience for taxi drivers were 75% Black. For supermarket cashiers, they were 85% female, and for lumberjack positions, they were 72% white and 90% male. For home sale ads, there was an audience of 75% white consumers based on this particular study. So as you can see, one of the issues presented by these algorithmic advertising tools, which are found on most social media platforms and utilized by a variety of industries, including banking and finance, is that the optimization objectives don't necessarily take into account whether the ad is being disproportionately delivered to a particular race or ethnicity or gender. And sometimes this can trace back to the initial data collection, the training data for the algorithm. If it reflects existing prejudices, then it may amplify them because the machine learning model will identify that pattern and will reapply it in perpetuity, which reinforces discriminatory stereotypes. To give another example from the banking space, let's say you take a population of your customer base that are on your private banking side that are very high net worth clients, and you go out to your digital marketing provider and you ask them to find people that have similar characteristics based on the trove of data that they collect about people. And they may go out and they find other consumers with similar characteristics who happen to play golf and be members of country clubs, people who like to travel internationally and stay at five-star resorts. So you can see how the set of consumers that is being identified may not ultimately be representative of all consumers who are likely to be creditworthy and may be skewed based on race, age, and/or sex. Another example in the financial services industry comes up commonly in the fraud space. Sometimes people living in minority areas are more likely to be victims of fraud and other crimes. So a fraud model may flag those transactions more often, but the way that geography is being used may or may not be appropriate depending on how it is flagging transactions in particular areas and how much weight geography is given compared to other indicia of fraud in the model. So with those examples, I'm going to now turn it over to Jenn to talk a little bit about the federal landscape and how the federal government is starting to think about regulating the use of AI.
Thanks, Tori. Those are some really great examples and definitely give us some interesting food for thought. So I'm now going to give you a bit of flavor for the existing AI-specific legislation and guidance that's out there. Both state and federal governments are working to develop laws for the regulation of AI. However, governments are struggling to keep up with the fast-paced and changing nature of AI-based technology. As a result, there is currently a limited amount of existing law that directly addresses the issue, particularly with respect to mitigation of bias associated with algorithmic use. For today's purposes, I'm going to focus on existing AI regulation and guidance at the federal level that touches on bias and discrimination concerns. Niketa will then talk a bit about upcoming AI regulation at the federal level. The existing guidance is broadly supportive of AI innovation, but AI-specific federal legislation has yet to be enacted. However, a number of bills and policy measures introduced in recent years have hinted at increased public support for consumer protections from the possible negative impacts of AI. I'll briefly touch on a few of these. So first, on November 17th, 2020, the Office of Management and Budget issued a memorandum setting forth agency guidance for the regulation of AI applications. The memorandum raises 10 primary policy considerations for agencies to consider when setting forth regulatory and non-regulatory approaches to AI applications that are developed and deployed outside the federal government, and it recognizes the importance of innovation and growth in AI. I won't go into all 10 policy considerations, but I wanted to flag a few of them that are key to the issue of bias in the use of AI. For example, the memo calls for consistent application of risk assessment and risk management in evaluating AI. It also focuses on the considerations of fairness and non-discrimination, flagging that agencies should consider the impacts AI applications may have on discrimination, and acknowledging that AI applications can replicate real-world bias that produces discriminatory outcomes. And finally, the memo points out that disclosure and transparency can boost public trust and confidence in AI. Disclosures should be written in plain language so that the public can understand the AI application being discussed. Next, I want to talk about the National AI Initiative Act of 2020, which was passed on January 1st, 2021. The act provides for a coordinated program across the entire federal government to accelerate AI research and application in order to ensure the development and use of trustworthy AI in the public and private sectors. The act also established the National AI Initiative Office, which is charged with overseeing and implementing a national AI strategy. The act codified and expanded a number of AI policies, including an AI risk assessment framework, which will test for bias in AI training data and applications. And the act also directed the National Institute of Standards and Technology to develop a voluntary risk management framework for trustworthy AI systems, including a focus on mitigation of unintended bias. Drafts of that AI risk management framework were published during 2022, and a final version was published just a few days ago on January 26th. The framework is meant to be a guidance document for voluntary use by organizations that are designing, developing, deploying, or using AI systems to help manage the many risks of AI technologies. Its goal is to build characteristics of trustworthiness in AI, such as accuracy, explainability, robustness, and mitigation of unintended or harmful biases. The framework is divided into two parts. The first discusses how organizations can frame the risks related to AI and outlines the characteristics of trustworthy AI systems. The second part is the core of the framework, and it describes 4 specific functions: govern, map, measure, and manage, to help organizations address the risks of AI systems in practice. For each of these 4 functions, the framework gives detailed steps and sub-steps to help organizations and individual AI actors achieve effective risk management programs. A companion playbook was also released on January 26th, which suggests ways to navigate and use the framework in order to incorporate trustworthiness considerations in the design, development, deployment, and use of AI systems. The playbook is not yet considered final, and the NIST has said that it plans to work with the AI community to update the framework periodically. Finally, I want to talk about the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, which Tori mentioned previously and which was unveiled by the Biden White House on October 4th, 2022. The blueprint sets forth 5 principles and associated practices that it says should guide the design, use, and deployment of automated systems to protect the American public in the age of AI. The blueprint seeks to address and protect against the problems that may arise in the use of automated systems. For example, it specifically flags the concern that algorithms used in hiring and credit decisions have been found to reflect and reproduce existing unwanted inequities or embed new harmful bias and discrimination. I want to talk a bit about principles in the blueprint that are most relevant to the issue of bias. So the first is safe and effective systems. The blueprint explains that automated systems should be designed with consultation from diverse stakeholders to identify risks, concerns, and potential impacts. AI systems should also undergo pre-deployment testing, risk identification, and mitigation, as well as ongoing monitoring. Next is algorithmic discrimination protections. This principle is probably the most relevant to the issue of bias that we're focused on today, and it states that you should not face discrimination by algorithms, and systems should be used and designed in an equitable way. The blueprint suggests that algorithm developers and deployers should take proactive and continuous measures to protect from algorithmic discrimination, including conducting proactive equity assessments as part of system design, using representative and robust data, employing plain language reporting, and conducting independent evaluation in the form of algorithmic impact assessments. Another principle is notice and explanation. The blueprint notes that designers and deployers should provide plain language documentation and notice of AI use, including clear descriptions of overall system functioning and the role AI plays, as well as clear explanations of outcome. And the final principle I'll flag is human alternatives, consideration, and fallback. The idea behind this principle is that people should have the ability to opt out of AI systems in favor of a human alternative where appropriate. And the blueprint also includes a technical handbook for anyone seeking to incorporate protections into policy and practice. So now we're going to take a look at some upcoming potential legislation. An increasing number of federal bills with AI-specific provisions have been introduced in Congress in recent years, and Niketa is going to talk about one of those bills.
Thanks, Jen. Yes, so let's talk about what's in the pipeline. Congress has made significant progress towards a data privacy law with implications for AI. Last year, the House Energy and Commerce Committee approved the American Data Privacy and Protection Act, which, if enacted, would be the first comprehensive federal privacy law that would prohibit direct and indirect algorithmic discrimination. Now, the bill has faced significant resistance from various stakeholders, so its enactment is unclear. But regardless, it does provide significant insights as to the type of oversight of AI tools that lawmakers and regulators may seek to exercise in the near future. So first, what falls within the bill's scope? The bill would apply to covered data, which is defined as information that identifies or is linked or reasonably linkable to one or more individuals. Some covered data may be considered sensitive, which would include government identifiers, such as a driver's license or social security number, as well as traditionally sensitive information related to health, geolocation, financials, login credentials, race, and sexual history or identity. There are a few different types of entities that the Act would apply to. First, a covered entity is one that collects, processes, or transfers covered data and is subject to the Federal Trade Commission Act. The Act also defines a large covered entity, which would be subject to additional oversight measures by regulators. And finally, the Act also applies to service providers and third-party collecting entities. One last thing on scope, the bill defines covered algorithms extremely broadly. It would cover almost any decision that utilizes automation as part of the decision-making process, even if the ultimate decision is made by a person. Now, the portion of the Act which is most relevant to today's discussion is Section 207, Civil Rights and Algorithms. And under that section, covered entities or service providers may not collect, process, or transfer covered data in a manner that discriminates on the basis of race, color, national origin, sex, or disability. Unlike most existing state privacy laws, Section 207 would go a step further by requiring companies to evaluate certain AI tools and submit those evaluations to regulators. Covered entities and service providers would have to complete what are called algorithm design evaluations. Now, prior to deployment, they would have to evaluate the design, the structure, the data inputs of the algorithm to reduce the risk of potential discriminatory impacts. And the Act would require the use of an external independent researcher or auditor to conduct the evaluation to the extent possible. And the company will be required to submit the evaluation to the FTC and to make it available to Congress upon request. Now, for large data holders who use algorithms that may cause potential harm to an individual, an algorithm impact assessment is also required. The draft bill provides a more detailed description of these assessments. It requires things like a description of the design process and methodologies, the data inputs used, including any data used to train the underlying model, and a description of steps to mitigate potential harms. It still remains to be seen how this proposed legislation will fare, but it's a useful exercise to take a look now and start thinking about these types of oversight measures. In terms of what else is in the pipeline, the FTC has also been fairly vocal about taking an active role in this area. In blog posts, it has called for increased fairness and equity and has repeatedly announced its intent to take enforcement action against biased algorithms. Under Section 5 of the FTC Act, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which Tori will get into next. Most recently, in August of last year, the FTC published an advance notice of proposed rulemaking with the purpose of obtaining feedback from the general public on data security and algorithmic bias, among other issues. The advance notice was very broad. It featured 95 questions in total, often with multiple parts. And the notice makes clear that the FTC is interested in expanding its ability to protect consumers affected by AI bias, including by expanding the FTC's authority to seek financial penalties for first-time violations. It includes significant questions about the impact of AI and machine learning systems and whether the Commission should adopt rules regulating or limiting those systems. So with that, let me turn it over to Tori to talk in more detail about the laws that might be implicated by AI applications that result in unintended bias.
Thanks, Niketa. So as we just laid out, the regulation of true AI is really still in pretty nascent stages. So if you have a model that's found to be biased, other than having just a total PR nightmare on your hands, what are some of the existing laws and regulations that you could be running afoul of? If you are operating in the credit or housing space, there are federal and state anti-discrimination laws like the Equal Credit Opportunity Act and the Fair Housing Act. The same is true for the employment context. If you are an insurer, then you're subject to state insurance anti-discrimination laws. And also there are certain states like New York and California that have very broad anti-discrimination laws that aren't tied to a specific industry. So these laws could potentially be triggered by issues of algorithmic bias. But there's also this other set of broad jurisprudence that can also be implicated by biased algorithms. And this is a relatively new development. These are laws that prohibit unfair, deceptive, and/or abusive actor practices, also known as UDAPs. Within the past year or so, federal regulators, including the CFPB, the FDIC, and the FTC, among others, have taken the position that discrimination can meet the standard for unfairness under the Dodd-Frank Act and under Section 5 of the FTC Act. So what this means is that for activities that previously did not fall squarely under a federal or a state anti-discrimination statute, they now may be fair game. And in the CFPB's press release announcing this change, it highlighted areas like deposits, payments, and credit reporting as potential areas that they would be looking at for this new quote-unquote unfair discrimination. Late last year, the FTC filed a complaint against an auto dealer that for the very first time alleged unfair discrimination under Section 5 of the FTC Act as an independent legal claim. Although this was unrelated to AI, this development is notable because the FTC Act's reach is incredibly broad, applying to anything in or affecting commerce. So this new enforcement tool could potentially be used by the FTC to go after any sort of model that they believe are biased in virtually any industry. One other thing I wanted to mention in terms of the regulatory landscape is under the Biden administration, we've seen significant activity among financial services regulators related to AI uses and products, some of which Niketa mentioned already. And importantly, there seems to be coordination among these regulators. So in March of 2021, the U.S. financial regulators, including the CFPB, the OCC, the FDIC, the NCUA, and the Fed, issued a request for information on financial institutions' use of AI. The largest set of questions in the RFI relate to issues of fair lending and considerations associated with the use of AI, including challenges that institutions face in evaluating bias and discriminatory impact on protected groups. Based on the RFI, the agencies will likely focus on addressing issues of bias, fairness, transparency, and explainability with any upcoming federal regulation or other guidance. So that's a quick summary of the regulatory landscape around AI and potential implications for biased models. With that, Niketa, what type of practical guidance can we provide to our listeners today about how they can help mitigate some of the risks that we've highlighted?
Sure, Tori. So we'd like to suggest 5 high-level principles to manage these risks within an organization, kind of like a starter toolkit, with the caveat that any risk management process should be tailored to the needs of the specific business, its employees, and users. So the first principle is to try to understand your training data and identify limitations. There are 2 main ways that bias typically shows up in training data. Either the data you collect is unrepresentative of reality or it reflects existing biases. The first case might occur, for example, if a deep learning algorithm is fed more photos of light-skinned faces than dark-skinned faces. Now, the resulting face recognition system would inevitably be worse at recognizing darker-skinned faces. The second case is what happens when a recruiting tool, for example, is trained on historical hiring decisions which favored men over women. The algorithm might learn to do the same and could overwhelmingly recommend male candidates over female candidates. So it's a good idea to think about whether your training data is representative of reality and what inherent biases are present in your data set. In particular, consider your audience and local communities and whether the data is representative of those communities. Consider whether the sources of your data are reliable and reputable. You may need to source additional data to round out your data set. You also may want to be on the lookout for proxies. Attributes that are highly correlated with demographic features are known as proxies and can contribute to algorithmic discrimination. Proactive testing might be performed to identify proxies by testing for correlation between demographic information and attributes in any data you're using. Now, of course, it isn't possible to remove all bias from pre-existing data sets, especially since we can't always know what biases an algorithm will develop on its own. It's an iterative process, and it may be worthwhile to continually retrain algorithms on data from real-world distributions. Jenn, can you walk us through the next 2 principles?
Sure. Thanks, Niketa. So the next principle to mitigate bias is to consider and debate that very issue. That may seem relatively simple, but it can be surprising how often it falls by the wayside. Talk about bias. Engage in fact-based conversations around potential human biases. Consider the risk of bias from a technical, legal, reputational, and ethical perspective. That means engaging a cross-functional team, including from engineering, legal, marketing, strategy, communications. Consider how you might define fairness for different applications of your AI. It won't be the same for every application, and it will vary across companies. And be cognizant of your company's mission and values, and make sure the way you are approaching deployment aligns with those values. Here's one idea. You could run algorithms alongside human decision makers, comparing results and using explainability techniques that help pinpoint what led the model to reach a decision in order to understand why there may be differences, and then have a discussion about those differences. The next principle is to document, document, document. Self-regulatory practices can be immensely helpful at the outset in detecting and mitigating bias, and later down the line to show that there was a demonstrated effort to do so. Create a bias impact statement where your team can assess the algorithm's purpose, process, inputs, outputs, and potential biases. Questions to ask are, who is the audience? What are the potential bad outcomes? What intervention will be taken in the event of bad outcomes? What groups are we worried about when it comes to training data errors? What is the feedback loop? Is the design team representative of the end users? Make sure to maintain good documentation of the decisions made and the reasoning behind them, and how particular risks were addressed or analyzed. Niketa, what are the last two principles to mitigate against bias that you think are worth flagging for our listeners?
So the fourth principle is to increase human involvement. Consider how humans and machines can work together to mitigate bias. Some human-in-the-loop systems make recommendations or provide options that humans double-check or can choose from. Another way to increase human involvement is to advocate for control systems and observations, such as random spot checks on machine learning software and human review of results. The idea is really that while more data can inform automated decision-making, AI should really complement rather than fully replace human judgment. In some systems, like an AI-powered or supported credit application, there may be an expectation by consumers of human involvement in determining access. So consider human-led alternative processes that consumers can opt into. It's also a good idea to train those employees that administer, interact frequently with, or interpret the outputs of an AI system, including on how to spot and mitigate the effects of unintended bias. The training may need to occur more than once during a life cycle of an AI tool. And these individuals ideally have the authority or a direct line to those who have the authority to influence the design of the tool in case changes need to be made. And for our fifth and final principle, we suggest building a set of best practices or principles for the use of AI if it makes sense to do so within your corporate structure. Consider engaging internal audit teams or third-party auditors to help build a set of practices. Now, certain of the principles we've discussed today might speak to you more than others, or there may still be additional ones that are better aligned with your organization's mission. When building a set of practices or principles, the key thing is to make sure they align with your organization's values and complement existing protocols. Once built, we recommend circulating those principles or best practices broadly within your organization and embedding them into existing governance. Now, this can often be challenging if you are a large organization. You may need buy-in from the leads of different business functions. So it's a good idea to involve them during the drafting process so that they're engaged and so that the principles or best practices reflect the needs of the business. You might also consider an AI lead or a committee that reviews novel applications of AI that pose heightened risk or that impact consumers. So with that, it's a wrap for today's episode. Thank you to our audience for listening. If you have any questions about today's podcast or anything else related to global financial markets, please email us at gfm@mayerbrown.com. Thanks for listening.
We hope you enjoyed this program. You can subscribe on all major podcasting platforms. To learn about other Mayer Brown audio programming, visit mayerbrown.com/podcasts. Thanks for listening.